little less than a couple of weeks ago, President Joe Biden, made a pretty stunning announcement based upon Joe Biden when he was not president, when he was simply campaigning, and frankly, a stunning announcement relative to what we have seen over the past 2 decades, which is, in particular, our involvement in Afghanistan, which many called the forever war. And Joe Biden has announced that war will be ending months from now, September 11th, or by months from now, unconditionally. And to tell us and put that into context and tell us what that means, Stephen Wertheim, the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, joins me. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Great to be back.
So, okay. Why don't you tell us just basically what he announced and why this represents a departure for Joe Biden in some respects, and then we'll talk about to what extent it's a departure from what some people refer to the blob, as it were, or the inertia that has built up in Washington, D.C. And I guess we should also start by putting into context for those folks who aren't aware of just how long the Afghanistan war has been.
We're coming up on 20 years as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11. U.S. military operations began the next month after 9/11. So it looks like we will just fall short of about a 20-year war for the United States. Joe Biden, coming into the presidency, had a decision to make. The Trump administration had reached an agreement with the Taliban by which U.S. troops, all U.S. ground troops, were supposed to be withdrawn by May 1st of this year. And the idea was that in the meantime, the Taliban would do a number of things, like relinquish any ties to al-Qaeda, and there would be peace talks between the Afghan parties, between the Taliban and the U.S.-supported Afghan government. The peace talks did not make much headway. They were delayed for various reasons. And so Biden entered office deciding, did he want to breach the agreement that the United States made with the Taliban to fully withdraw ground troops by May, or did he want to withdraw? And he essentially has chosen to withdraw, but he took some time to try to bring about progress first between the parties in Afghanistan. That didn't succeed. So instead of fully withdrawing U.S. ground troops by May 1st, he says he will start the withdrawal by then, and they'll all be out, the president announced, by September 11th of this year, which should allow for NATO member forces to also withdraw their ground troops. Most likely, the ground troops will be able to be withdrawn several months after May, and so it shouldn't take all the way until September 11th. But this is a pretty profound thing, because we've seen several presidents say they do not support endless war. Barack Obama said that when he decided to, in fact, continue endless war in Afghanistan. Donald Trump said great nations do not fight endless wars. He did put the war on a path to termination, but he didn't complete that. And he actually ramped up U.S. military operations in the country in his first several years in office. So for Joe Biden, who obviously supported the war on terror and the war in Iraq originally after 9/11, to make this decision took, I think, a lot of guts.
All right. Well, let me just back up for one moment. Like, to what extent do you think a second-term president, Donald Trump, is actually going to pull out the troops in May? I mean, I know this is, speculation, conjecture, but I just remember Iraq and there being dates set and things being punted constantly. And I mean, and we'll get to this, but one of the things about Biden's announcement, which I thought was probably the most important was the idea of there's no conditions. I'm making a decision and there's no conditions. There's nothing that can happen that will change this decision. There was a lot of those things, conditions built into the Trump thing that was, we hear all the time. Like, it's not my fault that we're not leaving because they didn't do their job. That's not happening with Biden. But do we have a sense? I mean, do you have a sense, or is that just like, I don't know? Am I asking you to predict, what would have happened in an alternate universe?
Hard enough to predict what Donald Trump would do, even harder to predict, I guess, a hypothetical Donald Trump that would have continued in office. I actually do think that Trump was prepared to fully withdraw from Afghanistan, or at least a good portion of the man wanted to. There were reports after he lost the election that I think perhaps he wanted to be the president to end the war. So there were reports that he was looking into making a full withdrawal, and he actually did reduce troop levels in Afghanistan then. He was trying to perhaps effect a full withdrawal before Joe Biden came into office. So it is possible to me that he would have gone through with it. However, it's also possible that Trump, who announced that he wanted to withdraw from other places like Syria, would have once again been foiled by the members of the Pentagon or the national security community who wouldn't have wanted to do those things. So it is possible that Joe Biden actually had an advantage in being able to withdraw from Afghanistan, which is to say, from reports, it looks like Pentagon leaders did not want the United States to terminate the mission, but Biden heard them out. He ran a process that did not involve going on TV or tweeting first and announcing something and then having to walk it back. But he really, listened to people and ultimately said, this is the decision.
All right, fair enough. I won't, impossible to know that scenario, but I was just, curious in that respect. All right, so let's just focus on Joe Biden in terms of his history. And during the campaign, he was not talking about any type of full withdrawal from Afghanistan, was he? I mean, and so this is a departure for Joe Biden. It feels like, I don't want to. This is not Bulworth here, and we can later we will talk about sort of like how durable the Biden doctrine is, but just give us a context for Joe Biden, the man, as to where how we got here, because some of the things he said in his announcement, over the past couple of weeks, were pretty, we're off brand.
Right. So I think we have to make sense of how Joe Biden got to this point, because you're right. On the one hand, in the campaign, he did say he wanted to bring an end to forever wars, but his campaign statements were fuzzy about what exactly that meant, and suggested that there would be fewer ground troops in Afghanistan and the Middle East, but not a full withdrawal necessarily from Afghanistan itself. But if you look back over what has been reported about Biden's positions on the Afghanistan war over about the last decade, within the Obama administration, he was consistently urging a smaller force, not a withdrawal, but a smaller force narrowly focused on the objective of fighting terrorists as opposed to building an Afghan state, eradicating the heroin trade, all those larger objectives that the United States said it was going to try to do when the Obama administration effectuated a surge of troops to about 98,000 U.S. troops in the early aughts. And it does seem as though Biden has felt for quite some time that the United States did not have clear or achievable objectives in Afghanistan. And his own remarks in announcing his decision suggested exactly that. And they're significant, I think, because they do implicitly blame President Obama for making the wrong decision. What he basically said was, we had a legitimate objective to conduct military action in Afghanistan, which was to decimate al-Qaeda after 9/11 and to punish the Taliban. And that was it. And anything further was not an achievable objective, was not the right objective, and should not have been attempted. And, it's a little bit fuzzy, when exactly Biden will have to look at this. I'm a historian by training, so, I'd like to get a hold of those documents, but it'll take some time. When exactly he came to the conclusion that the United States should stop waging the war in Afghanistan. So it's quite possible that he actually has been in roughly this position for a while. What I think has emerged more clearly, though, for the last 5 or 6 years is that, even defenders of the war in Afghanistan, like David Petraeus, who came out criticizing Biden's decision, or Lieutenant General McMaster, one of Trump's national security advisors, they essentially admit they're in favor of endless war. They don't see any way for the United States to actually achieve its objectives.
I just want to remind people that John McCain, when he was running in 2008, I think it was, when they were asking, like, how long do we stay in Iraq? How long do we stay in Afghanistan? I think he said, I can't remember exactly which country it was. He's like, but we've been in Japan for 60 years. We've been in Germany for 60 years. Like, who says we have to go? Let me ask you this about that mandate in going into Afghanistan. It seems to me that I recall after 9/11 that there was part of selling this war, and there was a buildup over the course of the, people were talking about Afghanistan far more in the summer of 2001 than I remember in years before. Maybe it was also in 2000, but it was there. We were hearing about the Taliban destroying statues, I think, of Buddha, and we were hearing about the treatment of women in Afghanistan, and there was certainly a pitch that was made. It may have just been, sort of gratuitous, but we're going into nation build. I mean, that was, in fact, it was heightened because I think George Bush on the campaign trail said, we're done with nation building. And part of the sale of going into Afghanistan was, we're going to go in there, and when we leave Afghanistan, it is going to be a much better place.
Right.
For people. And I'm sure that there's been some of that on some level, but how much of that mandate was just not really a mandate and was really just part of the sale, essentially? Was that jettisoned because they wanted to go to Iraq, which it seems to me that was always on the mind, the moment after 9/11? Bush would, said to Clark, the counterterrorism chief, I think at the time, like, or everyone in the room, like, you find out how we can go to Iraq. Because of this. So where, what was that original mandate? I mean, and has it changed over the years?
Yeah, the president understandably did a bit of cleaning up of the historical record when he presented, this was our original mission, right? And it was just and simple, get al-Qaeda, right? They hit us, we're going to get them. But from the very beginning, there was a sense that the United States was going to effectuate some kind of transformation of Afghanistan and leave it, whenever that may be, leave it a very different country than the United States found, quote unquote, when it began military action after 9/11. Different members of the Bush administration had different kind of objectives. Some of them, strange as it may seem, like Donald Rumsfeld, didn't really like nation building. They did like the spectacular use of American power. And one of the things Rumsfeld reportedly said actually on 9/11 itself was that this was an opportunity to go massive, sweep up things related and not. I'm paraphrasing pretty closely here. And he had in mind Saddam Hussein. And one of the problems with, after the Twin Towers came down, after the Pentagon was hit, for the United States to actually focus on Al-Qaeda, the organization that perpetrated those attacks, would have been an unspectacular thing. It would have meant focusing on intelligence collections, raids, and it could have been over very quickly. And there was a real need, I think, very broadly felt beyond the Bush administration, certainly in the United States, to do much more to prove that the United States was indispensable and it was going to transform, it was going to do big things with its military, and that would be good for entire countries and entire regions.
I mean, what you're talking about is a neocon vision of essentially exporting American democracy, which you could also probably read as American, sort of capitalism, to these various places around the world. That we were going to be, we were going to make nations and we were going to create some type of Pax Americana. And this is going to be a way, and people should also realize too that, and now that I say it, I mean, I'm even a little taken aback by it, but the distance between now and when we went to Afghanistan is twice as long. In fact, more than twice as long of time than Afghanistan was to the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And so this is still in the wake of what is this new world order that we're going to create? And that was all part of the Project for a New American Century with Dick Cheney and Richard Pearl and that whole neocon group of people. And so this was very infused in Wolfowitz, very infused into our responses here, which was, this is our opportunity to become the hyperpower that we were destined to be on some level. All right. So when we come back, given all that, let's talk about Joe Biden's, to the extent that there's a Joe Biden doctrine here, if there really is a Biden doctrine, and if it is even possible with the system that we have to have a sustainable doctrine like this one. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back. I'm talking to Stephen Wertheim about the end of at least this forever war. We'll be right back after this. So, Stephen, in the last segment, we went through the context in which we entered into Afghanistan and the understanding and the sort of the malleable understanding of what our goals were there. And I think at one point, certainly the Bush administration, when we attacked Afghanistan, so there was a fuzziness about what the American agenda was. It was definitively to get Osama bin Laden. It was presumably to punish the Taliban, because remember, the Taliban offered up bin Laden before we attacked, is my understanding. At least that's what was reported contemporaneously. But we clearly wanted to make, to root out everything and to maybe and to show the world that we were going to punish the Taliban, and theoretically we were going to rebuild Afghanistan, having had some responsibility for extending their civil war against the Soviet Union, and in many respects creating the Taliban by funding madrasas in Pakistan. And we had now thrown our lot in with the Northern Alliance, which was another group of Afghan tribal leaders, and so at one point, that part of the nation building went away. I don't know if it was when we left after not getting bin Laden there, or if after 5 or 10 years, people are like, who are we kidding? But that's clearly gone now. So Joe Biden comes out. He makes this decision that is, maybe consistent with where he had been, but not necessarily publicly in the past. But tell us how he articulated this decision, because that may be the most important part about it. I mean, it's 2,500 troops. There's still going to be a NATO presence. We're still going to have drones and special ops. But let's just talk about the way that he framed this.
Biden could have gone out and said, look, we have bigger fish to fry. We have a lot of needs at home. You know, there are other, if you want to talk about terrorism, there are other terrorists in the world who may be bigger threats right now than those who reside in Afghanistan. And, you know, China is a bigger threat that requires more resources than anything coming from Afghanistan. And he did a little bit of all of those. But he really did zero in on the logic of forever war. His central argument, he didn't duck this issue. His central argument was that the United States cannot win in Afghanistan. It does not have objectives that are actually fulfillable. And if it can't win, it must quit. And it was exactly that logic that had been resisted by President Obama toward the end of his administration, and by many in the national security establishment. So he really did zero in on precisely the logic of forever war. This isn't just a slogan, by the way, that's a kind of complaint about war in general, forever war or endless war. I think there's a real meaning to this that is deep, that captures a reason why the slogan has come about only in the last decade, because it became evident that the United States was defining its goals so expansively in a way that could not be achieved, that literally it implied waging war forever. And people have been advocating actual forever war. Let's just do this forever, like the British Empire. That's what they're saying. And Biden really did look that logic straight in the eye and say, no, that is not what we're going to do. And he recognized that in the short term, the consequences in Afghanistan may unfortunately be quite negative. But he nevertheless said, you know, essentially, if we try to defend one Afghan city for the Afghan government right now, that all but implies defending that city indefinitely, forever. And if we don't want to do it forever, we must not do it now. So it was a very clear exposition, and it raises the question, it establishes a standard for himself to apply as he now evaluates the wider so-called war on terror, as he evaluates why the United States continues to have ground troops in Syria and Iraq. And it's a standard that others can hold him to. So I think it was a really valuable, not just a valuable decision to withdraw all US ground troops, but also a valuable public reasoning about it.
I mean, it's almost like the dicta from a Supreme Court holding, right? I mean, that is, he like you say, he could have come up with a couple of different reasons as to why we would leave, but he is fundamentally zeroing in on this concept of forever war. Now, we should say, that there's a lot of people who would argue by, keeping special ops there and drones and this and that we're actually engaging in a forever war on some level. What is that distinction? And I ask that with the understanding that, on some level, it may be a distinction without a difference. But is there a difference? I mean, like, if we have special ops over there and a couple of those. What are the implications in real practice as to the difference between that?
Well, I think that there is a big difference. For the United States to have ground troops in a country, it probably has made a significant difference to the strength of the Afghan government forces compared to what assistance from out of the country might be able to provide. We'll have to see. I fully agree that even if Biden does follow through and removes all ground troops from Afghanistan, if the United States is droning people continuously, if it's using special operations raids, that's part of forever war. In fact, what in a larger perspective, if that's what happens, then what Biden may have done will be to make the forever war more sustainable and more politically palatable. So we should watch out for that. And if the goal is to just kind of shoot terrorists, we have to ask ourselves, how does that end? But the only thing I would say is at least Biden, as the president, has clearly articulated the notion that it's unacceptable to be engaging in that kind of open-ended action where no resolution is even in theory possible. This is why it was so damaging to have framed the post 9/11 response as a war on terror.
Right.
I mean, terror is an emotion, it's a tactic, it is unfortunately, part of human experience. So it is inherently a forever war if we're at war with terror. And Obama's version of countering violent extremism, which was supposed to be a more polite version, same deal there. It's also a forever war framework.
Was the forever war a function of a military industrial complex that just needs to continually expand, like a shark, like it needs to keep moving? And that means that we need to, we have 2,500 troops there. We're going to need to we're going to arm them. We're going to feed them. There's a lot of money to be made in having those troops there. Was it a purely, Smedley Butler war is a racket type of situation? Or was there also this sort of neocon vision of, if we can just keep a lid on some low-level conflicts all around the world, we will not, there will be no mechanism in which to challenge us?
It's got to be all of the above. And look, I think there was a legitimate purpose for the United States to engage in military action against al-Qaeda after 9/11. And I think that explains the public support for the war in Afghanistan for quite some time. And that's why, Barack Obama continued to view Afghanistan as the good war, to which he massively increased the U.S. military commitment, even as he said that Iraq was the dumb war, the stupid war. So it's all of those things. But it is worth noting, I think, that at this point, the United States had about 2,500 or 3,500 ground troops in the country when President Biden decided to terminate that mission. So in the larger scheme of things, it's not the war in Afghanistan that is keeping the so-called military industrial complex afloat. And, one might say that the damage that the war in Afghanistan inflicts, the political damage, may do more harm than good at this point to the larger system. So the administration has requested a Defense Department budget for the next year of more than $700 billion. It's comparable to the previous administration's approach. That does not suggest a desire to massively retract the U.S. military role in the world on a structural level.
Right. I mean, I think there's none of that. The only thing that does jump out at me, and maybe this is wrong to sort of connect anything between those. I mean, this is clearly not a repudiation of the machine. Essentially, it's really more like a tactical, a repudiation of a tactic. The idea is that we're just going to have to find another war in which they engage in, and we'll just make them shorter. But I did think this was interesting. He said in the speech, "I know there are many who will loudly insist that diplomacy cannot succeed without a robust military presence to stand as leverage." I found that very interesting. The idea that we don't necessarily have to be deployed. That our military, that to me seems like a fundamental refutation of a sort of a conventional wisdom that you go in there and you pound and you pound and you pound, and that's what sets you up for diplomacy better than not, right? I mean, we almost saw that with Iran and the Israeli attack on their nuclear facilities, alleged Israeli attack on their nuclear facilities, as a way of like, yeah, we're gonna back foot them. I mean, we see this in Yemen too, right? With the Houthi. I mean, like this is a very conventional perspective on it. And he sort of says, no, that's not necessarily right. What's your take on that?
I was very intrigued by that passage because he seems to be to push his logic a little bit further. He seems to be saying that actually having boots on the ground inhibited us from using diplomacy to solve conflicts. Being a partisan, actively fighting as an outside power in Afghanistan made it more difficult, not less, for Afghanistan to find a peace of its own. Now, if you think about that a little bit more broadly, there's a very common view that somehow the United States needs to be the military hegemon of the world in order for there to be decent diplomacy, cooperation on common challenges like climate change, pandemic disease. All these good things can't exist without the structure of the US military behind it, outspending the next 10 countries combined, rigging the globe with 800 some overseas military bases. So if Biden thinks this way about the concrete situation of Afghanistan, what about the larger situation? Because it's also true in those examples you mentioned in the greater Middle East, that by having such close relationships with half of the region and making enemies of the other half of the region, the United States has made itself entangled and therefore often incapable of achieving positive results through diplomacy. Case in point is Yemen, where the United States ended up supporting the Saudi and UAE effort there as a kind of compensation for doing something that was in our interest to do, which is conclude the nuclear agreement with Iran. It's just madness.
That to me is sort of like the what do they call it? The green shoot of this, and it'll be interesting to see if that grows into a doctrine. The idea that we don't necessarily have to be actively participating in these things to be a better broker or a better I don't know, catalyst for peace. I don't have huge hopes, but I have a tiny one. Stephen Wertheim, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.